I call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Imagine the moment in 1974 when, talking with his friends, Eddie Koiki Mabo realised his land was owned by the Crown. Not by him and his people. Noel Lewis and Henry Reynolds recall, quote, Koiki was surprised and shocked. He kept saying, quote, no way, it's not theirs, it's ours. It had turned out to be one of the most significant moments in Australian history. And from then to that historic High Court decision on the 3rd of June 1992, Eddie Mabo showed us that a deeper appreciation of Indigenous Australia is the responsibility of all Australians. That the recognition of Indigenous history, culture and the challenges it faces are not an optional part of being Australian, but essential to who we are. Eddie Mabo Day, the 3rd of June, helps us identify, acknowledge and celebrate all Indigenous Australians and their contribution to the nation. It's a critical part in the process of reconciliation. But it's also a great moment to celebrate the life of a great Australian and remember a man of extraordinary vision, warmth and intelligence. Eddie Mabo's story is one in which I think Australians can take great pride. And I think it is also a reminder that Australia is at our strongest when we remember the stories of Indigenous Australians. One of the books that's made an impression on me is Stories of the Ngunnawal, a collection of stories of the local Ngunnawal people. And those stories reflect to me that so much of what Eddie Mabo was facing was also being faced here in the Canberra region. There had been suggestions in the middle of the 20th century that the last remnants of the Ngunnawal people had been gone. An article in the Canberra Times in 1985 said, quote, according to the writers, the last remnants of the Aboriginal tribes of this area were gone by 1911 with the deaths of Ned and Lucy Carroll at the Egerton Mission Station. The article went on to say that reports of the extinction of the Ngunnawal people had been greatly exaggerated, according to the very much alive survivor, Tom Phillips of Canberra. Tom Phillips was indeed a character, Deputy Speaker. One story has him being arrested while walking naked in the Namadgi area. Apparently he was called into a courtroom with a blanket wrapped around him. The judge said, what are you doing walking around like that? You can't walk around that in front of people. Mr. Phillips said, mate, he said this to the judge, mate, I'm an Aboriginal. I was born naked and I walk around how I want. I'm not going to sit here and listen to a man sitting there with a dead carcass on his head telling me I can't do this, can't do that. I'll walk around how I want. Another great survivor of the Ngunnawal people is Auntie Agnes Shea. She is a familiar sight to those of us who attend conferences in Canberra because she is one of the most frequent of those to welcome attendees to country. But Auntie Agnes also tells the story about how she, as a young girl, didn't learn the Ngunnawal language. She said that, quote, the elders decided if we kept using it at home, we wouldn't do it intentionally, but automatically would use it if we're off down the town or somewhere, and it would get us into trouble. By that, she means the risk of being taken away from her parents. And Auntie Agnes says, so they forbade us to use our language for our protection, and that's how we came to lose so much of the Ngunnawal language. I was around 7 or 8 around then. And it is a great source of pride to me to be a federal member representing the land of the Ngunnawal people, to be able to remember some of their stories and recognise the great strength of Indigenous Australia and that we are greater as a country thanks to that Indigenous heritage. This is, I think, broadly recognised by both sides of Parliament on this, the 20th anniversary of the Mabo judgment, but it was not always thus. The Attorney-General, in a speech on the 6th of June, reminded her audience of some of the history of the Mabo case. She said, "Disenfranchised by the Bjelke-Petersen government, Eddie Mabo, David and Sam Passy, Salulia Sally and James Rice, all from the Meriam people, set themselves the seemingly improbable task of literally creating a space for Indigenous rights to land and water, where previously this had been an impossibility." She points out that it was the Bjelke-Petersen government that dogmatically attempted to legislate away any prospect of native title. It was Tim Fisher who said that native title was unnecessary, as, quote, "dispossession of Aboriginal civilisation was always going to happen." It was Hugh Morgan who said that the High Court had thrown property law into chaos and, quote, "given substance to the ambitions of Australian communists and Bolshevik left for a separate Australian state." And it was Tim Fisher who said, quote, "Mabo has the capacity to put a brake on Australian investment, break the economy and break up Australia. A break and a break up we can do without." And it was John Hewson who, after native title legislation passed the Parliament in December 1993, described it as a day of shame. John Hewson said, quote, "The Coalition is totally opposed to this piece of legislation. It is bad legislation. It will prove to be a disaster for Australia. It goes way beyond the High Court. It introduces inequities into the Australian system. It consciously sets out to divide the Australian nation, and there is only one thing you can do with bad legislation, and that is to throw it out." And the reason I quote all of these statements made 2 decades ago by a business leader and prominent members of the opposition is that it reminds us of what the Minister for Climate Change has called the divide in Australian politics between the reformers and the wreckers. It reminds us that almost every reform that is now held dear in Australia wasn't gotten through bipartisan agreement but was hard fought for at the time. Great reform never comes easy. It is often opposed at the moment at which it is fought for, but in so many cases Australia can now look back to great Labor reforms like native title with a sense of pride. And I believe it will be so for the great Labor reforms like a price on carbon, a mining tax, a national disability insurance scheme and a national broadband network. Deputy Speaker, reconciliation works best in Australia when it is not just self-flagellatory reconciliation, although there were great wrongs done, but when it is also operates with a sense of pride. That moment in the 2000 Olympics where Cathy Freeman won gold, the moment when she lit the Olympic flame, these are moments that did as much for the cause of reconciliation as perhaps all the honourable speeches of this kind. The moment when Gough Whitlam poured sand into the hand of Vincent Lingiari and Lingiari said to him, "We are all mates now." These sparks of positive reconciliation are, I think, a great source of pride for all Australians, and it is with a great sense of pride that I remember the 20th anniversary of the Mabo judgment.